my understanding is that, and maybe I'm wrong, that stunting is a complex condition that we try to approximate by linear growth. And that maybe that's where we are failing because we are using probably not the best approximation. And that there is a need to look for better indicators for stunting. And by the way, talking from the perspective of someone who is in the field, it can be sometimes quite stigmatizing to try to sell stunting only through linear growth, especially when you are communicating to lay people. So now, my second point, which is still related to the position I'm thinking from, is it looks like we are, after less than 10 years, building a strong narrative around stunting. We are kind of about to dismantle that narrative. And if that is the case, what are we going to sell to the international community and to the donors? And what are the implications of this in terms of the credibility of the nutrition community?
I think, you're absolutely right. When we can talk about, stunting of plants or stunting of development in general, and what's happened is stunting meant, I think originally, the notion that it was incomplete or insufficient development, but we've defined it in a particular statistical way. And so now that way of defining it has sort of taken over the meaning, if you like. But I think it's important to remember that the concept of stunting is much broader than just falling in a certain place in a distribution.
So I don't want to use the word dismantle, because the last thing we want to do, and I think I need to change my presentation and come back to my motivation at the end, because there is this amazing momentum for nutrition, and we do not want to destroy that. So it will need some careful thinking, but again, for some of the uses, we do not propose any change. The tracking of countries, the tracking of progress, I think there is no problems. I don't see any problems with that. When it comes to individual programs, I think we need to upgrade or help people appreciate the fact that improving the quality of people's diet, that's a laudable thing to do. It's not because that doesn't immediately have an impact on their children's growth that's kind of a minor type of intervention. So I see it, I don't want to use the word dismantle. I think we need to have a richer set of outcomes that we look at.
It's not us as a field that deals with this. A long time ago, Matilda Cuomo, when she was the First Lady of New York State, advocated for and brought about putting nutrition education in every school in New York State from kindergarten up to grade 12, and then we were asked to do an evaluation. And the purpose of the program was to put better tools in the hands of teachers, the assumption being that good tools in the hands of good teachers will result in children learning. So we tried to convince Matilda that, well, we didn't really need to show that children were learning more, we just needed to show that teachers were teaching better. She wasn't buying that at all, right? Politically, she needed to be able to claim that children were learning better and needed an evaluation that would investigate that. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that we, and the we here is quite diverse, have different needs and different responsibilities and need different kinds of information to bring about and motivate and advocate for the things that we want. And this is meant to really continue a dialogue about this. I'm heartened by the investment I see that's being made very recently in developing other measures that will let us measure what's happening to children in a holistic way when we haven't had the means to do this. And to some extent, if we start using those measures and getting a bit fuller picture that will help to mitigate some of this problem?
Just commentary to move this really important discussion along. I mean, I think it's great what you guys are doing, socializing at this moment, you know, some of the weaknesses in the way stunting works conceptually and how it's used. Because if we're not ahead of that curve, others are going to call it out. I mean, let's look at the way politics is working in today's world. So I'm with Simi. I'm really worried about this kind of, you know, pulling the rug under kind of worry that people have. But on the plus side, I mean, stunting has worked really well and will continue to work conceptually as an accountability tool because it works at population level, right? That's really good at the macro policy level. It doesn't work so well at the proximate level. Everyday people, implementers, they can't see stunting easily. You've got to measure it technically and blah, blah, blah. But they can see a dietary diversity and the more proximate types of measures which we're now developing. So I guess I'm not saying anything nobody's really said yet, but there's that. I think what you're encouraging is a broadening of our toolkit in communicating, right, to different stakeholders. And the way we keep trotting out stunting, as you've highlighted, doesn't cut it anymore in the nuanced and specific targeted way that we're going to need. So I don't see this as undermining the whole project. I think it's the next phase in its evolution, right? And but we do need to be really careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to coin a metaphor, in thinking about where stunning still works really effectively as a mobilizing concept. You're not actually querying some of that. You're just highlighting where it doesn't work conceptually, programmatically, as a mobilizer on other fronts, right? I think it's important to clarify what you're doing here.
Sort of a corollary of what you're saying, I think, is that we have to be more nuanced as a scientific community about children growing poorly is a bad thing. It's a bad sign, as Jeff said. That's not the same as stunting. And one of the consequences that we both alluded to is that, women in Bangladesh tend to be about 13 centimeters shorter than we would expect. About half of that has happened by about age 5, as near as we can tell. The other half has to happen after that. And we've investigated very little about what's really going on in that period. And we need to get away from the idea that we can measure one thing and use it in every single instance. The underlying construct we care about is poor growth as a marker for poor environments that people, children and adolescents are growing in. If we can remind ourselves of that and then find for a particular purpose what's the best measure for that purpose, then I think that will help a lot.
I like how provocative the thought leadership is, but it reminds me of the rise and fall of protein energy malnutrition and the controversy around it. So I really agree with the colleagues that we need to emphasize the packaging. And what I would see as relevant packaging here is in the context of linking agriculture to nutrition, that we tell the donors that stunting is not it, and this is what should be. Maybe starting in that context will allow the thought leadership to seep into other areas. My worry in listening to the presentation, and maybe it's just me, was it sounded like broadly in many areas, stunting is not the indicator to use, which can make it very difficult for us to go back and say, no, we meant in this context only.
To your specific comment, I believe that the recognition that in the ag nutrition domain area, that stunting might not be the one outcome we focus on is growing quite rapidly. So I'm hopeful that, and clearly there's not a whole lot of, I think it's an easier discussion because it's about production, it's about what people consume, can afford. So you have a series of meaningful outcomes there that you can present and that people will, I think, get enthusiastic about because they're directly linked to what the sector is about.
We realize that it is more the studies that inappropriately use causality that endanger the messages that we send rather than comments like this that help us delineate between associations and causality. So thank you for that. But I also have an operational question that may be useful to some of us. Some studies of older adults have proposed using measures of linear growth in adulthood to retrospectively learn as markers about what happened to these folks earlier in life, to differentiate between exposure to deprivation, for example, early in life. I wanted to ask if you have comments on the potential of markers, not of linear growth, not only as a marker of contemporaneous exposure, but also of exposure decades earlier.
I have not worked on adults at all, but I think what I proposed in that proposed framework was that growth of children is a marker for the past deficient environment. I think that works for children, and I would expect it works for adult growth too. But I have not tested that out, so I...
Seems to me that your presentation has two different streams that are interlinked. The one is what seems to be like a systematic review of, the impacts of stunting on other kinds of outcomes like productivity, so on and so forth. And your point is really timely, and thank you for that, in saying that actually these causal linkages are not as robust, or perhaps don't even exist, the way we all have been writing in our first paragraph of every proposal and every paper. So that point is well taken, and I think it's time to do those kinds of analysis, and thank you for taking that forward. Whereas the second part, which I think perhaps I wonder if you linked it too strongly with the first one, which is where the concern probably is coming from, is really examining our theories of change and why we are proposing the kind of indicators that we are proposing. And perhaps the nutrition community has proposed stunting more strongly than it needed to be, even in programs where the theory of change and the causal linkage is really, really far away. So I'm just wondering if you might want to maybe think about how you would link these two streams of work you have done and you're trying to link and build an argument around that. And coming back to agriculture nutrition programs, sure, I think we are there. In fact, in the first round of ag nutrition proposals that DFID and BMGF did 3-4 years ago, I'm one of the grantees. And of course, I thought the donor would want stunting. I did a classic, blah, 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 with stunting and as outcomes, some 8,000 children, whatever, 4-arm cluster randomized control trial. And in fact, they did come and say that, why do you have stunting? You take it out. And actually, stunting is not our primary outcome anymore. And so I think we are already there. I wouldn't get too worried about it because I think the donors are already looking at that. I think so. I think we should keep the conversation continuing. And I think going back and forth is not just unique to nutrition. I think all scientific communities go through that, and we should be transparent and encourage that. Thank you.
I'm not entirely sure how I should or can respond to the first point, but maybe it's related to my concluding slide where I say, let's be more specific. And I think when we write proposals, when we think through what we would like to change and measure, to step back and say, stunting should not be the first thing that comes to mind. If we're really worried about children's development, then we should measure development, and that should be the primary outcome. And we should make sure that we're doing things that directly affect that, because there is more than just nutrition for child development. There is direct development interventions we can implement too. So I would call for more specificity. I don't claim to have all of the answers, but not just throwing stunting in there because that's what we've collectively done for the last decade or two.
I know at least in some instances, disability-adjusted life years are calculated for stunting in and of itself, and that's used in, types of evaluations, measurements of cost effectiveness, et cetera, et cetera. And so what would be your recommendation around sort of moving forward on that? Would it be similar in terms of taking stunting away as an outcome and using some more of the component-related aspects that I guess stunting is proposed to capture, or some other approach?
I have to think this through because I know that the burden of disease people use something like risk factor terminology, and I'm not quite sure if that, I don't think that implies causality, but I have to look it up. I don't know.
You're highlighting a really challenging issue. A couple of us have just done a project that the Gates Foundation asked us to do, to look at, with Sonia Hess at UC Davis, to look at what the Global Burden Disease Project is doing, how they're doing this in relation to nutrition, because it's obviously of critical interest to us, because that's a primary way in which sort of the world finds out about where nutrition fits into the rest of the development agenda, if you like. And there's not an easy answer that I can give right now, but the bottom line is that your question's really important. We don't have enough information to know how it's really being used and done. A lot of assumptions have to be made, and it's filtered through this risk factor sort of strategy that the Global Burden Disease Project uses, but their documentation's insufficient for us to really know what's happening. And so, given that that's the primary user of that, we can learn a lot if we can just get better information out. So the call is being made for that. We have a paper in review about that, and the foundation, which of course funds the Global Burden Disease Project, is keenly interested in getting some better answers about that, because theoretically it should be a better way of capturing what the burden is if we use disability-adjusted life years, but it has to be done in a way that makes sense. And it's not easy because of everything that Jeff said, in his presentation.
I was just wondering, there's, in terms of the traditional focus on stunting and maybe the traditional study design, if especially the issues you're highlighting in terms of the gaps of what we don't know and looking at linear growth in a lot of different ways, in a more holistic way, if it wouldn't really push us as a community into other types of study designs, for instance, cohorts or sort of some kind of longitudinal panel data where we really visit these kids over time and learn a bit more about what's going on, although of course there are funding constraints and this and that, but if it wouldn't push us towards opening back up to not just the traditional RCT on stunting.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valuable comment, and I guess that's one of the things we're hoping will come from this, is that it gets us to start asking more questions about what's the best way forward. I think the importance of the perspective that Jeff presented, I think, is that if we really grasp the idea that stunting and linear growth is most often a marker of a poor environment, our job in intervening is to improve the environment. And then the question is, what's the best way we can measure whether or not we're improving the environment? And we're not the only ones dealing with this. I do a lot of work with a large international group interested in how alleviating food security can improve HIV management. The clinicians are always, in the HIV world, are always going to be interested in viral load and want to know whether we can show that viral loads are lower. But that's not really what the work is about. The work is about changing the conditions so that they can manage their disease better. And so that's the parallel. That's what we want to do, is to put the focus on what we're really trying to accomplish, which is have children and adolescents grow up in better environments.